Okay, have I scared you enough now? All right. This will be interesting because the reactions to this movie are quite interesting. So let me, without further ado, introduce you to three people very key to it. First up, as I mentioned in the intro, he's an Oscar-winning composer for All Quiet on the Western Front. Last year, nominated again for Conclave, many other awards from Golden Globes to BAFTA and on in his career. And he just came from the premiere of yet another movie he has this year, A Ballad of a Small Player with Colin Farrell over at the Egyptian. So he goes from one theater to another with his movies. He's that popular as a composer now. Volker Bertelmann right here.
Thank you.
And, as I mentioned, she can clarify this. I don't know the exact number of actors with speaking roles in this, but it's over 100. And she is a very well-known casting director from movies like Argo and Moneyball and on and on and on. And, of course, this film, she's the casting director. And this year is the first year that the Oscars have a category for casting, which is long overdue. This is Susanne Scheel. And one of those actors from this film, you saw him right at the end in the last third there, and he's done many movies, from Little Mermaid, where he sings, he's a great singer, and so many other things that he's been in, and of course this film where he plays the aide to the President of the United States, played by Idris Elba. Welcome, Jonah Hauer-King. And since we just left you on screen here, let me start with you.
Okay.
Jonah, what the hell happened? You can tell me. It is, I know it's meant to be full of ambiguity here, how this film ends, but...
Yeah, it's a great conversation starter. People have very different views on what happens next. Does the bomb go off? Does the president retaliate? There were a couple of creative choices that Kathryn and Noah made, I think, from the outset.
Noah Oppenheim being the
screenwriter, who's an expert in the field and a brilliant writer. I guess two of the main ones were, where's the missile coming from? We don't want to know. And what happens at the end? We don't want to know. And I think the reason for that is they felt like the ambiguity was helpful for a couple of things. I think for the former, it does create a narrative tension. There's a thriller element to it of trying to work out where is this coming from. But I think also that as a device, they didn't want to point a finger. This is not a film about saying this is the most likely country to be sending a bomb. And
it could be from AI.
Well, it
frankly.
could be. Yeah, it could be a mistake. It could be anyone. And that final thing of, is the president going to retaliate? I think it's more trying to raise the question of, do we want to be living in a world where there are over 12,000 nuclear bombs out there? That's not a world that I feel particularly safe in.
That you want to be living in a world or not?
Yeah, he loves it. I think it left me feeling find it quite a compelling ending, because I feel it sort of left empty in the sense of, yes, wanting to know what happened, but also realizing that it's so much more about the next stage. It's also, what are we going to do in that situation? When that first bomb is sent, the whole kind of house of cards, this idea that we're much safer with all the bombs, that all falls down. A lot of people have come out, and I think a lot of the cast have had different views on what they actually think happens. I've never asked Kathryn, did you?
They never wrote it. It was never part of it from the very beginning. So it's not been written, and it was, very purposely done, as you said.
She did that on purpose. She has told me that she likes they decided they like the ambiguity of it, because her point is this serves as a warning. Not so much even as a film in her mind. She wants to do a warning. When in the 60s, when they had a lot of movies like this, like Dr. Strangelove and Failsafe and Stanley Kramer's great On the Beach, where at the end of it, it's just a banner floating in the wind that said, "There is still time, brother." I think that's the message here. There is still time to get this out. The other day, we were doing the Academy screening, and she showed me on her phone afterwards, she got a message from somebody involved with the START Treaty. And she was so excited because he said, this is so needed right now.
Yes, it's a conversation starter. And I think it was, if we focus on the who or the why, it loses the narrative. It's really the what. It's that it exists at all and that this is where we're at. And she didn't want there to be like a villain. They just didn't want there to be like someone to point the finger at, because then it takes off any responsibility we have to start the conversation, to continue the discussions. Because it's quite easy to say, well, that's the bad guy. And it's like, well, that's not the point. There could be many.
It's definitely a global thing. And sitting here, we have the United Nations, a mini version of it here, because you're from, Volker, you're from?
Germany.
Germany, yes. You're from America. And you're from?
London.
I got to ask you, I love... The British actors, you would know this too, the British actors are so good with the American accents.
Me and Idris were laughing that a couple of Brits are deciding the fate of America up there. And you got Jared Harris, the English Secretary of Defense, and Jason Clarke and Rebecca Ferguson. But I guess, I mean, Suzanne can speak to this better. There's, I guess the casting was sort of not about that, right? It was kind of, but we did laugh about it. But I think Idris is very presidential, don't you think? He's very very Brit or American. He's very tall and handsome and charismatic, and I think he might be quite a good president. You know.
What did you think about that scene, which actually did scare me, because it was clear the president had no idea how this works. And that is a true thing. They don't have rehearsal time here.
That's right. I mean, everything in the film was, like all of Kathryn's films, researched to within an inch of its life. 3-4-star generals patrolling the sets, sometimes on camera, but always off camera. And it's a strange thing because pretty much all of the people advising the president are so trained and so rehearsed. But like he says in the film, he isn't. He gets more training for the judges. And I think what's interesting about it from my character, and I think lots of the roles in the film, is that even though they are rehearsing this all the time, they're doing it 400 times a year. I think when the thing actually happens, there is a different energy and there's a different dynamic. And you see it in my role. This is someone who's very prepared, but he's also, the humanity creeps in and maybe even some fear creeps in. And that's just the reality. And also just that it's a strange position for this quite young man to be in, because he's trained for this thing, which he probably thinks he'll never actually have to do. He'll probably never have to sit next to the president and advise him or her whether to retaliate or not. So it's quite a strange psychology to be so prepared and yet not actually do the thing until suddenly they're in crisis.
And not know who you're retaliating really against. It's
right.
Really a roll of the dice. Suzanne, how many speaking parts?
113.
113.
Principals, yeah.
Wow, congratulations. Is this the biggest number you've ever done?
Yes, I went back and checked. And I think one unique thing to really highlight is, as Jonah said, like it was researched within an inch of its life, and that the two gentlemen sitting behind Tracy Letts, one was a 3-star general and one was a 4-star general, and they both came from Stratcom.
They're in the movie.
They're in the movie. So we were sitting one day in rehearsal and looking at those two folk, and we had seen all kinds of actors for it. And I just looked at Kathryn and I said, why are we trying to cast this? And she said, what do you mean? They're so important. They have to be there. I said, well, no, they're there. Let's just put them in the movie. And luckily they agreed, and then we did it in a few more spots. But also, two of our primary actors, Malachi Beasley and Gabriel Basso, have military experience. And then about 90% of our featured background also have military experience. Like, being authentic and being credible was always the most important part of all of our jobs. And that was the goal and the aim every day. And we found it. Actors are so beautiful and trainable, but the people around the main actors, she said, they just carry themselves a different way. They speak a different way. And we don't have time to train hundreds of people to do that. So she said, let's just get military. And so we went on this incredible journey with a woman who had worked with Kathryn on her commercial. She's done commercials for Veterans Affairs and Advocacy. This woman, Kathryn Farangi, did Kathryn's commercials with her, and she and I worked together and did all the featured folks as well.
Wow. Was it difficult to find just the perfect actors for this compared to other movies that you've done? Was there a big casting thing that you put out there?
So Kathryn had this incredible book that she had put together, and so none of the characters are based on specific people per se, but she had at least one or two examples of people who had filled each job. So like the head of Secret Service or a Secretary of Defense or a Chief of Staff. And there was a few, she's like, I really like the energy of this guy, like just to keep in mind. So we had specificity in that of like what we knew these people were, attributes they were likely to have. So that was one aspect of it. And then it was also knowing the actors were so skilled that in such a short amount of time you would connect with them quite quickly, so that when their storylines play out and they're worried about their son at the doctor, or, the end that we see Jared Harris's character take, we're like, that moment, more than anything of who we cast, like that has to break your heart and that has to make you jump in your seat because you cared about that person, hopefully. And they have about 18 minutes of connection on screen time to do that. So it was much more those conversations too. Like, we completely believe Jared is a credible Secretary of Defense, but in those human moments, who's going to also connect? Can they be very credible in their position? But when you see the cracks and you see them break down, it feels very real and subtle and nuanced. And I think that was the constant conversation that they had to fulfill both.
He's always around disasters now. He was in Chernobyl, too. Volker, another great score, but a totally different one. And when I look at your score for All Quiet on the Western Front, that's World War I. The Conclave is the Vatican, and that this is something that might not lend itself to music right away, or does. Explain your thinking here and working with Kathryn on what kind of score you're going to do for this.
Well, first of all, the film is very realistic, and it's in 3 chapters divided, which is for a musician always, when you see that the first time, you're like, 18 minutes, and then it starts again, which means you have to find a formula that works in these kind of repetitions, and at the same time, a realistic movie, you don't want to destroy that with, let's say, sobby instruments or like a sobby melody. Or so what I tried to find was somehow the angles where I could support the activities and the plot in a way. And so my first thing was I looked into instruments where I could do more moanings, like where the undercurrent tension could be expressed with. And so we did a session in London at Air Studios with low woodwinds and low brass. We were singing into the moaning, into the baritone saxophone, for example, where they did like and then at the same time,
at the very beginning,
yes,
yeah,
and at the same time they blowing into the instrument. So I wanted to have something that is a little bit like an animalistic sound, but at the same time also something that is very dark and creates a kind of tension that is rising. The other thing was the violins, in a way, were for me representing the humanity, and maybe even the humanity in connection with maybe something that is beyond the humans, like something angelic, maybe a little bit like religious, maybe, where I think, towards the end, when the president is alone with Jonah in the helicopter, I think that is the moment where I felt this is the most emotional and lonely moment, because in that moment all the decisions, everything that was beforehand is suddenly coming together, and one person has to, even the phone crashes when he talks to his wife, and then he's just by himself and making this decision. And I felt in the beginning we had at that moment still tension music. We felt like maybe we do 3 arcs of tension, but then Kathryn and Kirk and me, we decided to start the emotional arc earlier. So when he's in the helicopter, and I think that is something for the whole film. The humanity brings the catastrophe much closer to you, as well as I think the missing end is something that when you go in a pub after the film, maybe you are not in the mood of going to a pub, but I would go with my friends afterwards, and we have a lot to talk about. And I think just because there's no defined ending, you feel like there could be a lot of explanations, and that's the same with the music. I try to not solve with music the emotional situation. I just wanted to support it here and there,
which too many movies do. You can telegraph everything times with a bad, with one that's trying to tell you too much musically that deviates from it. And what I loved about your score here is where you're almost feeling like you're not even hearing it, the silences that are purposeful.
Yeah.
And you're also working with the sound designer, Paul Otteson.
Yes, and I think Paul did a great job specifically with the cannon shots. When this cannon goes off, I could put all my bass drums away. You know, it was, I had on that same spot a big orchestra bass drum, like where I boosted the bass a lot. Then Paul came with a cannon shot and I said, okay, I will use that for my next techno track as a bass drum. You know, it was really, really impressive. And what is nice about that is that, you know, Paul had also the feeling for silence as well. And I think to create tension arcs, you also need moments where you have very quiet moments and maybe you're just breathing and, you know, you see somebody thinking and then it starts again.
Amazing. Did you do a lot of research into playing an aid like this? And
I mean, I would have loved to have spoken to someone who actually did the job, but they wouldn't let me anywhere near someone holding the nuclear football. So I got, but I mean, two things. Firstly, Kathryn's films, generally speaking, sort of live and die on their authenticity, that they're so well researched. And so when we're sent the script, so much of it has been done for us. It's amazing. A lot of it is already on the page. But I saw this book, this kind of character book, and I saw the person that I was like a version of the person that I was trying to be, and I sort of looked into the type of person that might be given that job. And what's interesting about it is that it's someone usually of an 04 ranking, so 01 to 010 being the highest. So it's kind of middle ranking. So this is someone, you know, they go to naval college, they become an ensign, they become a lieutenant, and then they're a lieutenant commander, which is where you meet this character. But for him, it's sort of a stepping stone. You know, it's a huge responsibility and a huge honor to be given this role. But also, this is probably as part of a long military career. This is quite literally a badge on the chest. And I just found that interesting. Like, I think this is someone who, you know, wants to have a longevity in a military career and sees this as a great honor, but is probably almost looking towards the next thing. Like he's ready to do his job, but he's also looking at what's next. And then suddenly you're ripped into a crisis, a global crisis. And I found that really, really interesting. And also the fact that he is comparatively young. You know, as the president says, like, how old are you? 30, 32 or something? What's going on here? And I think that's interesting because it creates an interesting power dynamic between him and the president. Because on the one hand, the power imbalance is huge. It's the most powerful person in the United States and a strike advisor. But actually, in that situation, because this person is so much more knowledgeable about this specific subject, that creates a reverse power dynamic as well. So I tried to think about that. And then the only other bit of research I did, which I don't know if we've really talked about this, but these people are usually in really good shape. And I showed up, there was two parts of the shoot. There was the DC shoot and then the main shoot in New York. And I showed up in DC and Kathryn very, very, very politely said, I wonder if you might be a bit sort of more muscly. And I was like, okay. So for the first bit of the shoot, I wore a muscle suit, kind of like a Halloween costume. Did you know that? Did you? So I was sort of walking around like this. And then I had about 2 or 3 months to go away and then try and get as big as I was in the muscle suit, which I failed to do, obviously.
Little secrets of the trade
Secrets
here.
of the trade. But there's a very funny costume picture of me wearing my kind of Superman Halloween costume underneath the uniform, because the picture reference that she had was this like incredibly athletic, strong guy who I had to somewhat imitate.
Another thing, Susanne, is that you have this big cast, but they're all in individual acts. However, this was one giant set, side by side. They had all three going on, so you're not working against a green screen, in other words.
Yes. So we no one outside of like the top cast ever read the script. And so we would book actors and like in their minds, they're maybe on 15 to 20 pages, but we booked them for weeks and they said, well, we don't understand. I said, oh, you're going to be live in every set when we're in the other set. So when we're in Stratcom, Greeley and the White House Situation Room are live. So the phones worked, the cameras worked, everything, like they could call each other legitimately. And when Tracy Letts was here a few weeks ago, or last week, he said, I can't imagine trying to do this movie if I was looking at a green screen, looking at a feedback, video feedback, instead of the real person in real time sitting there and talking back to me. And it made all the difference. And agents thought we were out of our minds. And they were just, we don't understand. He's only in this bit part. Why are you booking him for 7 weeks? And I just said, it's for me to know and for you to find out. I think again, with Kathryn, it's like there's no detail that is not covered or discussed or thought of. And it was just, it made such a difference. And like to have your fellow actor there and just the camaraderie and all of it that it created on set of like, we're all there to support each other and make sure we get the best performances out of everyone, because you're actually acting against your fellow actors instead of a blank screen or a video feedback that keeps going, whether you keep going or not. So it was fascinating. And I got to be on set a lot more than I ever have on anything and just watch these sets interact with one another. And it was fantastic.
So unique, amazing. Must have really been helpful, I would imagine. Yeah.
It was. I mean, Idris and I had it slightly differently, only because we have a slightly more intimate setup. But yeah, I mean that's again, Kathryn is all about making environments that feel real for the actors to step into, and that was just true every step of the way. And when it came to actually shooting, Barry Ackroyd, the DOP, very incredible DOP. The cameras, you often have no idea where they are because it's all about a kind of voyeuristic style. It's almost documentary-like. Certainly in the big scenes, when they're running a few cameras, you had no idea where the cameras are. So it means you're very present, you're very focused. There's no switching off. There's no traditional coverage where you're doing wides and mediums and close-ups. It's everyone's alive, everyone's reacting all the time. Even in a car, you think and then suddenly there's another camera behind you, and it's like, how did they get into the boot? So it keeps things, very fresh.
It's amazing. Let's see if you guys have any questions out there. Yes, right there. Okay, we did talk about that a little bit, but
everything we were told
about the president
specifically is that they run one drill, and that truly would have been the first time that book was taken out and opened in front of him. That is from multiple sources what we were told, and like I can't comment on it, what I think should be the case, of course. But there's just so many duties, and it's like that in their minds is one of the least likely things that could happen. So they just don't do it, and that's part of what Kathryn is trying to expose, right? It's like, and the sole authority that only the president in that moment gets to decide what to do, and is one human that gets to push the button. And so it's, again, just to expose it and start the conversation. I agree with you wholeheartedly. It should be a very different situation.
Well, what if the president's senile?
That's not the case. No comment.
It's still one person. Has anybody tried to change this in some way?
That's the point. And I think to think about who sits in that office, but also think about, like, should that be the case, that one person? It did make sense to me, though, that it is the one person, given you have such a short amount of time. There's no time for a congressional vote. There's no time for the cabinet meeting. It is so quick that these things have to be decided. So it actually does make quite logical sense that one person would have that control. It doesn't make it any less frightening, perhaps, but it does make sense that it would need to be that quick of a decision.
It's an eye-opening thing. Anybody else? Okay.
If I had John Williams' Jaws in mind in connection with these two notes at the beginning. Well, I mean, it's a very typical example for a score that sticks with you, Jaws, and just because it has a very significant, quite short motive, and I'm a big fan of short motives. I think I've done that already on All Quiet on the Western Front. I did a 3-note motive, and I was very scared that it's maybe not considered as music, because 3 notes seem to be a little short maybe in terms of melody, but it doesn't need to have a kind of long melodic arc to be memorable. Sometimes it's even better to have a short, significant sound. And I'm a big fan, specifically when it comes to scary movies, to use more like small motives, because there is so much sound going on in each, and in this film specifically, a lot of language, a lot of conversations. I have not much space to put a melody somewhere, and I'm not a big fan of making long melodies under conversations. I have always the feeling that is not necessary, specifically when there are wonderful actors. I think I don't need it. So in a way, I may be using the same method, but I didn't think particularly about Jaws when I was starting it.
Anybody else? Okay, you're in the front, so I'm just going to put the mic here so we don't have to.
Jonah, I loved your work on World on Fire, which aired on PBS like 4 years ago. And I loved Conclave. I just loved it. I also saw it twice. A question for the three of you. In watching this film with your kind of score that was very tense and leading up to something, I want to know how you feel. My feeling throughout the whole movie is that a lot of people didn't know what they were doing, like what's going on. They had to go through manuals and chains of commands and a lot of people and a lot of confusion. And of course, in the end, the president has to make a decision. So what was your feeling about that? Is that something you talked about with Kathryn? Because I felt the tension, but I also felt like nobody knows what they're doing. And even really at the end, the president doesn't really know what decision to make.
Yeah, I think it kind of speaks to something interesting about the way the whole system is set up, in that there are procedures that kick into place and there's a rehearsed methodology for how we react in moments like this. But I think partly what it's raising is that there is still not only room for error, but there's just room for humanity, and there is room for emotion in these moments. And no matter how many times you train, like that, I think that very moving moment when they're in the missile base and they said, we did everything right. And I think that goes to show you can do everything right, and you can have a system in place that in theory works. But you're kind of, I think, setting yourself up for failure if you live in a world where nuclear bombs are able to fly around. Because as soon as you fire a nuclear bomb at someone or anyone, no strategic system really can deal with a situation like that. And that's probably the problem, because I think people do know what they're doing, but it can come across like they don't, because it's such a frantic and such a pressurized situation. And really, I think people are being set up to fail. And so I think that's what the conversation is about, is that maybe there's once one is fired, then what do you do?
And so the president does one drill, but then, Stratcoms, like Tracy Letts' character, they do about 400 a year. So the people on our crew, Kathryn and Noah and Jeremy, our production designer, who did get to go and visit all these places and meet the real people, their big takeaway was like, these people are highly capable, highly trained, calm, just seem like generally good humans. And they actually walked away from those spaces feeling very reassured. Of course, it's, again, a drill is very different from the real thing. All the different school drills and things Kathryn talks about, during the Cold War, hiding under her desk and thinking, this is ridiculous. What would this help me? Now there's very different types of drills, and you can only ever be so ready. And I think, of course it's a film and we need it to feel like a thriller and keep the pace. But I think outside of the president, I think, we try to depict that accurately. Like, they are just greatly underprepared, and it's no commentary on this president. It's just the fact of how it is. But every other office they felt, and also someone like Rebecca's character, for example, she knows so much more than she's allowed to say. Her job is to just push information up the chain. And she is, and particularly for her role, and also Jason Clark's, they know so much, but they can't share what's not directly in front of them. They just push information up. So I think that's probably the franticness you were responding to. But, and also it's a thriller, and we wanted to keep you guessing.
Well, I personally had the feeling that it was quite organized when I saw it the first time. I had the feeling it's quite a procedure, but at the same time, it feels for me that these issues humans have to deal with, which they self-produce, are getting so complex that it feels sometimes so out of. Well, I'm sometimes trying to go after I've seen something like that. I have to go into the forest just to get a little bit of simplicity in my life, because I feel like that's what where I actually feel myself somehow like a human. And I think these situations are getting so complex that I have the feeling it's maybe not anymore solvable, in the sense that people are able to get all this information into a good decision. It always will lead maybe into something that a part of humans are not liking in the end. That's my feeling.
As we do the 3 different sequences, it's quite bit at the end. And Kirk discussed that of like deciding, do we do the close-up shot? They had an after shot of showing him after he jumped. They decided not to use it. And they really felt like the pulled back wide shot, just in their minds, had the biggest impact. And if you watch the film again, as I've done many times, you hear the audio in the second act, and you hear them scream and yell after he's jumped. And of course, you don't know what that is. And then when you listen back again, you're like, oh gosh.
That's the great thing about the sound here, because these different layers of the story, even though you're seeing the same event, it keeps getting unveiled, and you keep finding things like a mystery, and seeing the film again, that'll even add on to it. But I think while you're watching it for the first time.
Yeah, and then you hear the president say, what was that? Like, they all hear it, and then you slowly get pieces of what it was.
And right there, yeah.
The line of, 50,000 deaths in one day, if you call that cool, or whatever she says to her little son. And there is, there's a fascination with it. So I think that was very intentional. And then I've been asked a lot about, the Kenya scene of like, that felt to some people random. I said, no, it's showing what we're preserving. This gorgeous land, these gorgeous animals. And I just thought that was such a brilliant part of the design of the script, and with Kathryn, is just showing us all these just little bits of humanity throughout, to then make it all the more devastating to think that this is possible, that this could happen. But yes, it calls back to like one of the most famous battles. Obviously, it calls back to American history, and it shows in some ways like, well, what have we learned? Like, people died, 50,000 people with muskets died in one day, and now we're looking at 10 million people, and proportionately, it hasn't changed. We're still doing the same thing to one another. So, yes, I think it was very intentional. Thank you for picking up on it.
Here's who I feel sorry for. I feel sorry for Chicago. First, the National Guard invades Chicago. Then the Cubs lose. And now your movie opens.
Well, we don't know what happens to Chicago. So, that was the part I mulled over, because Jared Harris jumps off the building. I said, we don't know what happens. And obviously he's just lost his wife, and then he calls his daughter, and their relationship's in a tough space. And then you see the calmness come over him when he realizes she's with someone that she loves, and they're walking to work. So he knows in that moment, when it happens, she won't be alone. But then he realizes, I don't want to live without her, and I've already lost my wife. And then I think, well, what if she survived and now she's orphaned? So it's just, it leaves so many things up to think about.
Which is great. Great things that movies do. And the great thing that this movie does is it gets people talking and informs them, and even, dare I say, educates them. So
I have to say, one of the most, I don't want to cuss in front, the badass moments I ever saw of Kathryn is, she was asked by someone, how do you want people to feel? Like, thrilled, excited, and without missing a beat, she just goes, informed. And I was like, in my head, I was like, mic drop. Like, that is what it's all about for her. And like, yes, it has to be entertaining, it has to be thrilling, but more information will get dispersed at a wider, if it's a very fun movie to watch versus a documentary versus an article or whatever. That in her mind, that was the way to go about it.
Yeah.
And that, first and foremost, is the most important thing, is the information. Like the emails she shared at that last talk was from, the nuclear advisor.
Right.
She's gotten dozens from artists and directors saying what a beautiful film it is, but the one that was important to her was that.
Yeah.
And that's the one she continuously shares. So
it's amazing. And again, I think Netflix gives this a global audience, and that's important too, to get this around the world. And and hopefully it's heated. Thank you so much for coming out here
Thank you
tonight.
for
Thank
coming.
you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll see you.